All right. My name is Ben Bugis. This is Give Them an Argument. I'm joined once again by Ethan and Vic. Oh, shit. Where's Victor?
Yeah, I don't know. I think he's in, what did he say? He's in like France or something?
Yeah, something like that. Something more fun than this. That's fine.
Yeah.
But just Ethan, who is a co-host along with the absent Victor and also Matt McManus, who was very recently a guest on the show of the Academic Edgelords podcast, which people should check out. I was just on there talking about a paper about whether utilitarians should be sacrificed first in trolley situations. I thought it would be interesting to watch this debate between Krystal and Saagar and Enjeti on breaking points that happened a little while back. This is not super fresh, but it's obviously much fresher than a lot of what we watch on these breakdowns. It is from the last few months. For a couple reasons. Like one of them is, I'm just getting back from, traveling for a few days and, figured do something short and sweet tonight. But also, this is a topic that came up recently in a debate that I did a few weeks ago with, internet personality Stephen Bennell, better known as Destiny, and in there was a point where in the Q&A segment, there were a couple of times where there were jabs that the other person didn't really have a chance to answer because the way the Q&A was set up, right? You couldn't just continue to go back and forth. And one of those was about this.
Every single thing he says is a lie. None of these things are true. Whenever somebody criticizes a particular type of a way of conducting war, the other side will say, oh, they can't do that. They need to do this. Oh, they can't do that. Oh, they can do this. Like, it would be interesting if in another world we saw, oh, well, if Israel did special operations, would people like Ben Bugis actually support it? The answer would be no. He might say another thing, but thankfully we live in this world. We can literally go and look. There were 4 hostages that were rescued as part of a special operation. The article that Ben Bugis wrote on that starts with, last Saturday, Israel massacred hundreds of Palestinian civilians in an operation to rescue 4 Israeli hostages. American commentators rushed to justify the brutal operation. Remember, when these people say, I don't like the type of weapon used, I don't like the particular strategy, I don't like this, what they're really saying is Israel does not deserve to fight. They should never fight. They don't have any cause for war whatsoever, and they should be forced to accept whatever concessions the surrounding countries want to place on them. That is always.
Yeah. So he was right. I did write an article started exactly that way. It is kind of funny. It's sort of, as I'm rewatching that clip, it kind of looks like he was taking a look at it for the first time as he was bringing it up. But this is the article. It's called "Israel Killed Hundreds of Civilians to Save 4 of Its Own." And he already read the. I think he said that's how it started. That's the deck, the summary at the top of the article. But in any case, I did say that. Implicitly, he disagrees, as far as I can tell. The implied argument there is something like, well, look, if you even have a problem with this, because what Israel is doing in that instance, right? What the IDF was doing was a operation specifically to rescue hostages, not to do anything else. And so if you even have a problem with that, then clearly you're just lying if you say that like there's anything that they could do that you wouldn't object to. Because, if you're going to object to that, then you're just going to object, to absolutely everything.
Yeah, it's a sort of bizarre point. I mean, I don't know, like, it's sort of, I guess it's like maybe some, like I don't know, it's just there are clearly lots of possible actions, like on the spectrum of like violence to non-violence, that
Yeah.
are more towards the non-violent side of the spectrum than this particular action, and like, you know, extremely so. So to infer like, oh well, you didn't support an operation that killed like hundreds of civilians, you probably wouldn't even object to Israel denying every concession that Hamas lays forth. It's like, it's a bizarre inference. I don't know.
Yeah, I tend to think so, but in any case, since that comment was on my mind, I thought it would be interesting to check this out, since this is actually a whole, you know, it's not that long, it's like half an hour, but there was this whole debate on Breaking Points about the ethics of that exact operation. And I will even say, right, I'm watching this fresh, right? Like, I haven't seen this before, but I mean, I expect that if there's like half a case to be made for you know, for thinking that this is okay, it actually probably is going to be made here. Like, so like a while back on the show, we watched like, this was months ago, we watched Krystal and Saagar arguing about whether, you know, what Israel was doing in Gaza counted as genocide, and or, you know, or whether at least the sort of long-term goal was ethnic cleansing. And I remember thinking at the time that, like, I was very unconvinced, right? But I actually did think Saagar sort of made the best version of no, since at least he, you know, at least he wasn't like just kind of flatly denying, you know, the obvious facts about it, you know, and he was kind of trying to work with those as best as he could and say, well, okay, there are people in the government who do have this goal, but that doesn't necessarily mean blah, 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 right? So again, I'm very uncompelled, but I think that, you know, I think that was the best version I've heard of that. So, I mean, I expect that, you know, so I expect the same thing here. I mean, the kind of basic case for no, right, for thinking that, like, even if you think that, like, yeah, that there are things that the Israeli military could theoretically do that, you know, that I wouldn't have a problem with, or, you know, certainly not nearly as much of a problem with as what they actually have done, right? You know, which is to say, like, obviously I would prefer that nobody be making war on anybody, and there just be, you know, there just be like a permanent ceasefire that would lead to some kind of final status resolution of the whole conflict, and, you know, and that would obviously be what I would most want to happen, right? You know, but if you say, well, okay, are there things that could be done that, like, if, you know, after October 7th there was some sort of very targeted, you know, response to particular people who had planned it, etc. You know, that I wouldn't necessarily, you know, have an issue with that. I mean, my issue is that's not what's happened, right? Like that you know, that what's happened is this completely indiscriminate attack on the entire population that again does look like at the very least ethnic cleansing. But, you know, the sort of case for thinking that even if there are things the Israeli military could do that you wouldn't necessarily have an issue with, that you should still have an issue with this, is that I mean, two sentences, right? I mean, you could get back all the hostages by just agreeing to a permanent ceasefire. And B, if you think that Palestinian, you know, civilians matter as much as Israeli ones do, then the trade-off here is real bad, right? That you're killing literally hundreds of them to justify, right, you know, rescuing four. I really don't see how that can be justified if you think that these are all people who have the same, you know, moral status and all that. But, you know, that's the kind of basic outline of the case. So that seems pretty straightforward to me, but we'll see
Yeah.
if we'll see if Saagar can budge me on that. Do you have any other thoughts before we get started?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said, but like to even like sort of make the case like a bit stronger, like you could even like, because one of the things you said is like they could get the hostages back by agreeing to a ceasefire, and it's like I agree with that, but like even if you were like agnostic about that, like you could say like you could at least try before trying this other stuff, like even if you weren't convinced that they absolutely could get the hostages back without like sort of violent means, like you could still sort of reasonably argue that it's still going to be immoral to resort to the violent means before you've even like exhausted the peaceful options, and presumably Israel has not exhausted the peaceful options.
Yeah, I mean, I should say also that obviously this rescue operation happened a while ago. The current state of things, as I've seen it, is that Biden is claiming that both sides in principle have agreed to a ceasefire agreement, but there's still all these details to be laid out. I haven't really seen. I mean, I don't know. I get that. I subscribe to Haaretz's like daily updates, and I haven't seen anything there yet that makes me think that anybody else is saying this so far. So I guess we'll see. But the kind of general shape of things for quite a while has been that every time Hamas rejects a ceasefire proposal, it's because it wouldn't permanently end the war. And every time Israel rejects a ceasefire proposal, it's because it would permanently end the war. That seems like the basic dynamic, right? That the Israeli position is, temporary ceasefires are maybe okay, but we're not going to relinquish our right to keep going until the job is done.
Yeah, and then there's like this whole question of like, this is like sort of closely related, but it's like, like even putting aside, could they do a ceasefire now? There's also the question of like, did they have to like start the war in the first place? Like, were there ways of like getting the hostages back and like minimizing the violence that was to follow that didn't involve starting this whole war to begin with? Because like you could also plausibly say that if they didn't need to start the war in the first place, and then they did, and now they're in a predicament where like, the war can't end unless they keep doing these violent operations, then like the violent operations are still going to turn out like immoral because they're only happening because of this predicament that Israel immorally put both sides in,
Yeah, right. I think that's right. I mean, again, because there is the option, like at any point, right? Because there's always the where do you start the clock question, right? So I mean, certainly, it's not like there wasn't lots of violence going on leading up to October 7th and partially explaining why that happened, in the first place. But even if you assume everything up to and including October 7th happened, and even if we're taking the stuff that I would most like off the table, right? That like, just doing just immediately saying, okay, this has gone too far, time to put this to bed, and like having like a final status negotiation on a two-state solution, or I guess while we're dreaming, just saying, oh, we've decided to create a singular secular state now, and everybody's a citizen. But even if we assume those things are off the table, I thought Dave Smith's answer to this at the one with the debate he did with Dennis Prager and Batyanga Sargon and Cenk Uygur on his side was a good one, right? Like that's like, look, there is always the option of just like reinforcing the border defenses, maybe doing some targeted assassinations of particular people who planned it, and then again moving towards some sort of final settlement, maybe even not negotiating with Hamas, but just the PA or whatever, right? Give them the credibility of having negotiated a two-state settlement. So yeah, I think that this was a choice, right? I mean, it's like I always loved, I don't remember if this is Ralph Nader who said it, but it's like, I always love the point that's like, look, there's a world where the only thing that we did in response to 9/11 was put reinforced doors at airplane cockpits, and that was it.
Right? Yeah.
That would have clearly been a better world, right? Than this one. Even from a pure national self-interest standpoint, there's like no sense in which that would have been worse.
Right.
So you can make broadly similar points here.
And it's like in this context too, it's like, it's this weird thing where like the sort of like the pro-Israel group or the pro-Israel kind of team will sort of say like, they'll say things about how like, oh, well, we had to respond violently in this way because if we didn't, like, who's to say there wouldn't have been another October 7th and so on, and we needed to use like force as a deterrent, etc. But then it's like, there just was like a universal consensus, and there still is, that like the success of the October 7th attacks was like a miraculous fluke, where it's like, this should not have happened at all. And there are obvious like minor tweaks that Israel could do to stop it from happening again. Like, I think you mentioned like, just like putting more security around the border. Like, we're not even talking about, we're not talking about like the Great Wall of China here. It's like like a 40-mile wall or something. It's like, there just is no way they would have been able to break through that wall if there was a lot more troops there. Like, that seems like really straightforward. And so it's like, I don't buy the case for the war being like inevitable or like the only option at all.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's watch this.
Let's move on to this hostage rescue / massacre that occurred over the weekend. We can put this up on the screen. One woman, this is Noah Argamani, who was captured at that Nova Music Festival. And she really became quite famous because there was some horrifying video of her being captured and taken away. She's crying out for her boyfriend. This is one of the other male hostages who was released. But as part of this quote unquote rescue mission, you had just an absolute massacre. One of the deadliest days that we have had in this entire Gaza war. You can see here the rubble, you can see dead bodies, you can see the injured. And reports are that from the health ministry that 274 Palestinians were killed in this effort to rescue the 4 hostages. We can put this up on the screen from the Financial Times. They have some more details about what occurred. Their headline here, Israel's raid to free hostages takes horrific toll on central Gaza. Hundreds of Palestinians killed and injured in gun battles and bombardment that accompanied the operation. I'll read you a little bit of this again so you can get some of the details. The raid, which freed those 4 hostages, was a boost, they write, for Netanyahu's government, which has spent the last week arguing whether to agree to a U.S.-backed plan to end the fighting. But the devastating firepower used by Israeli forces also made June 8th the deadliest day for Gazans in months, with the Enclave's health ministry saying the raid, which was accompanied by gun battles and a fierce bombardment, had killed 274 Palestinians and injured 698. One medical chief described the horrific scenes in his hospital after the raid. The director of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital said they came with horrific injuries, torn lower limbs or upper limbs, some with broken skulls, their brains pouring out, some shot in the abdomen, in the intestines. There are women, children, the elderly. Houses have been destroyed and families wiped out. I also wanted to note from that article, you had the chief Israeli military spokesman, Daniel Hagari, because this is giving credence to those on the Netanyahu side of the equation who say, hey, we don't need a ceasefire, even though that's the way that obviously the largest number of hostages were released by far. And overall, Israel has still killed far more hostages through their military operations than they have rescued. But it's giving credence to this idea of, oh, no, we don't need a ceasefire deal. We can just do this again and just, massacre hundreds of Palestinians to rescue the rest of the hostages. But Daniel Hagari, even the Israeli military spokesman, rejects that view, saying, we know that we cannot do operations to rescue all of them because the conditions won't allow it. We saw already that what brought the biggest number of hostages home was a deal. There is no argument about that. And so, Saagar, I mean, it's one more instance where it's just very clear in terms of the U.S. political elite, certainly the Israeli political elite, but with our own political elite, that Palestinian lives just don't count the same way that Israeli lives do. You know, to celebrate this mission. And listen, I think the hostages should be released. You know, I'm happy for these hostages that they are home with their families, but at the cost of hundreds of Palestinians. This is celebrated as a victory. And, you know, 1,000 dead and injured, more that are trapped under the rubble. And this is considered a victory. I mean, it just shows you how grotesque the immorality around this has become.
Look, I think it's a tragedy, but this is a complicated one because this is one where they actually did achieve militarily what they had sought to. Now, listen, I will say this. The U.S. military does not conduct operations this way. They would never have pulled the trigger. The circumstances are a little bit difficult because what happened is that the vast majority of the deaths occurred after they had stormed the apartment building, and then apparently the vehicle that the Israelis were in broke down. They were getting fired on by RPGs, so they called in air support, basically clear out the road, take the hostages out, take them to the helicopter. I agree. I mean, it's an absolute tragedy, the number of civilians killed here. It also was like intentionally placed. I just think militarily, this is a very different operation than, let's say, carpet bombing the crap out of a refugee camp and saying, well, we hit a single terrorist. It was genuinely in support of a rescue, like hostage mission. You could see a Western operation like the U.S., something like this go down in a similar situation where our guys get bogged down. The hostages are there, the vehicle that they're in, you have to call in air support. At that point, it is a matter of life and death. I just think this one is a little bit different.
I don't think so.
No, it is. I mean, it's very different.
They bombed a crowded marketplace in the middle of the day.
Yeah, I mean, their troops were at risk.
Nearly 300 Palestinians murdered to rescue 4 people. You're right. I mean, on the one hand, our military would not have greenlit this operation. On the other hand, we were actually involved in some capacity. According to the New York Times, there was an American role. A team of U.S. hostage recovery officials stationed in Israel assisted in the Israeli military's effort by providing intelligence and other support. But going back to your comments, I mean, if you had, imagine Omar Badar, I'm taking this from he made this comment yesterday. I think it's so important. If you had Hamas massacre close to 300 Israelis to rescue 4 of their prisoners, by the way, Israel holds thousands of Palestinian hostages, no one would accept that. No one would accept that. Them going in and massacring innocent kids, women, civilians in a busy, crowded marketplace, taking out entire multi-story apartment buildings to get 4 people, no one would look at that math and say that that's acceptable. So why is it acceptable when it's Israeli?
I would flip it around and say, I think you're making a media point. I don't even disagree with you. I mean, obviously people in the media cut like a lot more slack, but I mean, any nation, group, etc., has the ultimate responsibility to look out for its own troops and for its own people. In this particular case, their people are at risk. They
also have a responsibility to follow the laws of war.
Well,
which,
I mean,
listen, Hamas held these hostages in residential areas. That is a war crime.
Yes.
That does not alleviate the responsibility of Israel or any other nation to take precautions when it comes to civilians. The fact that Hamas does something wrong doesn't give you a get out of jail free pass. And that's the way that they've acted. That's the entire justification for this entire genocide. They did bad things. They committed war crimes on October 7th. True. So that gives us a green light to do whatever the hell we want to do and not care one bit about Palestinian civilians. I mean, this was the deadliest day we've seen in Gaza in months. It's wholly unjustifiable, and especially given the context that there is a deal on the table to rescue all of the hostages without killing a single Palestinian civilian. So if Bibi Netanyahu and the rest of the military establishment and these far-right goons actually care about the hostages, then they would agree to the ceasefire deal that they supposedly put forward themselves. So it's not justifiable. And they also, let's put this next piece up on the screen. They also, as part of this, disguise combatants in civilian clothing. This is a picture, by the way, this isn't fully verified, but this is the image that was floating around of this civilian vehicle aid truck. This is a helicopter that landed right by the quote unquote humanitarian pier. The US is saying, oh no, we had nothing to do with it. You know, we didn't use the pier, et cetera, et cetera. But that helicopter is literally right next to the pier. So you make of that what you will. But put this next piece up on the screen. This is from Ken Roth. Disguising combatants in civilian clothing to commit hostilities constitutes perfidy. That is a war crime. And this is not from, Palestinian sources, which nobody seems to believe. This is from Israeli news sources. Israel's rescue team reportedly entered the area in a furniture truck driven by a female soldier in civilian clothes. There's a good reason why this is a war crime, which is if you're using civilian trucks, if you're using especially humanitarian aid trucks, think of how much danger aid workers have already been in this conflict. So now you're basically putting an even greater target on their back because there's a suspicion now, if you see an aid truck, that it could be IDF soldiers coming in to commit another massacre. So that's why that's considered a war crime.
But this is where I just disagree. It's like, well, then all, U.S. special operations are quote unquote a war crime. That's ridiculous. I mean, our people have
What are you talking about?
What? Well, you think we haven't sent CIA agents and Delta Force operatives disguised in civilian garb to go smash and grab or like rescue our own hostages or rescue Westerners? Of course we have. We've done it many times.
In an aid truck is another level
sure.
of.
Aid truck, yeah, I agree. I wouldn't do it. Obviously, the Israelis are going to be doing a different thing. But this is what I'm saying about the whole discourse around quote unquote war crime, etc. Like it's a lot of it is just a farce. It's not the way that people actually operate in a military environment. I think this one is
clearly not the way they operate in a military environment. But the reason that we have it is so we have language to talk about why it is wrong and why it should be out of bounds. And so that there is some way to put pressure and not just, they can murder people, so why not? Let's just look the other. I guess it's fine. They got 4 people, so, killing 300 and injuring another 700 and reducing another entire neighborhood to rubble, I guess it's fine because they can do it.
No, it's that look, at the end of the day, they were also under like a huge amount of fire. This was a very different environment. They're under RPG.
So if you want the hostages back, do the ceasefire deal.
I agree.
You don't have to murder a single Palestinian. There don't have to be little kids with their limbs blown off and getting amputations with no anesthetic and no mom and no dad. And by the way, a lot of hatred in their hearts and God knows what they're going to want to do when they grow up.
I agree that I wouldn't operate this way, but I just think this is very, very substantively different than a lot of the corporate bombing operation that we've seen all throughout Gaza, the intentional withholding of humanitarian aid, etc. But like, are we really going to say that operators are not allowed to go into a war environment and not, be
in humanitarian aid trucks? Yes.
I mean, look, I'm just not going to say that because given the fact that any U.S. citizen or others who are, if I ever get, abducted, do whatever you need in order to get me back. And I think that's how a lot of
people do a ceasefire deal. Well, Saagar, that's the thing. You're pretending like this was the only option. Murdering 300 people and injuring 700 others. That was the only, no. And by the way, guess what? The reports are from the health ministry that other hostages were killed, including potentially an American citizen.
That's possible.
Unconfirmed report. Yeah, okay, that's not confirmed.
Yeah.
But we do know that we had a quote from Israeli hostages, just one of the ones just released, who was talking to Haaretz, who said, our greatest fear was the IDF bombing that we heard. So don't talk to me about, this is fine because it got the hostages back. No, if you care about the hostages, do the ceasefire deal. That's what Benny Gantz, who, I'm no fan of, that's what he's saying. That's what the Israeli public is demanding. That's what the protests are all about. That's, by the way, even what the Israeli military spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, is saying, like, this is not sustainable. The way to get the hostages back isn't to murder little kids. It's to do a ceasefire deal and end this war. So no, I don't think it's excusable. And if you look at past historical examples of successful hostage rescue missions, there was a thread that somebody put out online. I wish I had it in front of me, but you'll see like 0 civilians killed, 0, maybe 3 civilians killed. 270? No, it's not proportionate. It's not acceptable, especially again, when there is a deal on the table that could bring all the hostages home and not require a single death.
I don't disagree that they should take the ceasefire deal. I agree the U.S. military never would have done this. We have a much higher level of professionalism, thank God, in terms of the people that we run. Our substantive disagreement is about the idea that you're not allowed to use like military force in the course of a hostage rescue mission, which...
All right. Maybe this is a good place to pause. Something I've been thinking about for the last couple of minutes is when Saagar said, if I'm ever taken hostage, do whatever you need to do to get me back, right? Which I've got to say just seems like one of those things that's like, well, you're inserting yourself in this situation, but you're you're doing it in a way where you're assuming that you're the beneficiary.
Right.
It's like, if I'm ever on a trolley track,
Yeah.
do whatever you got to do to stop the trolley.
Yeah. I mean, well, I guess that I guess this would sort of like, like if Saagar is like one of the civilians who needs to get killed to save some hostages, like designer ethics recommends that, maybe you do that. But yeah, I mean, it is sort of like, and I mean, like, obviously, like, yeah, it's like, oh, like if I would want them to do this if I was one of the hostages. Well, it's like, surely you wouldn't want them to do it if you're one of the civilians.
Right.
And actually, like, if you're placed somewhere randomly in this scenario, you're most likely going to be one of the civilians because there's way more of them than the hostages,
Yeah, if there were like at least a couple hundred direct, civilian deaths, several hundred injuries, and 4 hostages rescued, right? Then being randomly placed in the situation, you would be vastly more likely to be one of the victims than the beneficiaries.
But it's also just like bizarre, like, also to just say like, well, I think like, they ought to have done X because I would want them to do that if I were, in a position to be benefited by X. It's like, well, surely that's like not like a plausible, surely that's not like a plausible moral view.
Yeah, I mean, presumably not, right? I mean, because if you were there might be like any kind of sufficiently high stakes situation. If you were on one or the other side of it, right, you would probably desperately want people to do whatever would benefit people on that side of it, right? Like, I mean, if I'm the guy on the bridge overlooking the trolley tracks, like I very much don't want to be pushed, right? Like, that doesn't, that itself seems uninformative. And so it's like, if we're just saying like, if we're just imaginatively putting ourselves in the situation, then it does seem like the numbers become relevant. And if the numbers aren't relevant, presumably that's because we think the character of the action is what's important here. And if that's right, then I don't know what the point is of the, of saying like, well, if I were a hostage, I'd want you to do, whatever you could do to rescue me. I'm also a little unclear on the, this distinction between the situations where like refugee camps are being bombed because there's like one person who's a legitimate target there, and this I mean, I guess I'm not sure that there isn't a distinction, but it's just not obvious to me what it is.
Right. Yeah, that one is sort of questionable. I mean, maybe the idea is like saving 4 hostages is like more of a morally worthwhile aim than like killing one Hamas commander. Like, I guess I could see that.
No, that's fair. Although it also, I mean, presumably, like, if you think, I mean, I guess it depends on what the goal is of killing him, right? That if you think that what you're accomplishing by killing him is just like vengeance, then definitely, right, rescuing the hostages is a more legitimate goal. But I would think, I mean, just from having spent a lot of time in the last bunch of months arguing with people who are defending this stuff, that the more typical argument would be, well, the point of doing that is that you're like saving other people, by killing him, so he can't, plan the next October 7th or whatever. Which, I mean, I agree with some of what you said earlier about why, like, just the factual premise there isn't really that plausible. So I guess maybe I do agree with him that there's a difference there. But like, even if you do think that there's a difference, then, it can still be like, look, if I can think, like, like there are plenty of situations where you can think one thing is like worse than another, but still think that both of them are far below the threshold of justifiability.
Right.
It just doesn't matter, right? Like, you know, I could, you know, I guess I think that like, you know, I don't know, if you're like killing, you know, a 6-year-old girl, maybe that's worse than, you know, than you know, killing some other victim who we can come up with like a description of them where, you know, that there are like less things that would be bad about that. But like also if you're just killing that guy and you don't have an overwhelmingly good reason to, that's still a really, really bad thing to do.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so it seems like, yeah, I guess I could see that there is in principle distinction, but also that like the thing that's wrong with one of these is still overwhelmingly wrong with the other, right? Like that if you're saying, well, you have a legitimate goal to the operation that you're rescuing hostages, and then, you know, again, I think the point Krystal keeps making is the right one, that there is this really obvious alternate means of achieving that goal. But, you know, even if there wasn't, right, like even if that wasn't on the table, you know, you're still ultimately, you know, sacrificing like hundreds of times more equally innocent people for, you know, like, I mean, it's the equivalent if I'm ever, you know, if I'm ever on a trolley track, I'd want people to do whatever they had to do to get the trolley not to hit me, and you're diverting it to the track, you know, like from the track where there's you and 3 other guys to the track where there are literally several hundred people. Right? Like, it still doesn't really add up.
Yeah, there were like a few weird like moral tropes that Saagar kind of just like threw out there. And one is like, yeah, just like this whole idea that like, you know, that you'd say like, okay, well, here's a good way to evaluate like an ethical principle. Like, I assume that I'm in a position where I'm going to be extremely biased as to like what I want to happen, and where like my like egoistic impulses are going to override what seems like morally right to me. And like that morally right judgment, it's like, it's just like, that seems like the like exactly wrong, like you're going to want to be. And this is why, you know, like moral philosophers will come up with all these thought experiments like the veil of ignorance and stuff, where it's like, no, like when we're thinking about ethics, what we want to be is impartial. Like, you don't want to put yourself in a hyper partial, hyper biased position where you stand to benefit overwhelmingly and then think, well, what would I want to happen? Like, that's just like the opposite way. You know, it's like exactly the wrong way to like evaluate moral principles. But then there's like this other trope he threw out there where he's like, you know, when she's talking about like, well, why couldn't they have done this or that? And he's like, well, that's just not the way people operate in war. And it's like, I don't know, it's just like literally like a non sequitur, where it's like, if we're like, you know, like if me and somebody else are like in prison, where it's normal for prisoners to like beat and rape each other. And I'm like, you know, and we're talking about like philosophy and ethics. And I'm like, yeah, man, it seems like beating and raping people is really bad. And then my interlocutor is like, well, that's how people act in where we are. It's like, okay, that's just like literally not relevant to like.
Yeah, it's how people operate in prison. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, it is also weird. Like I saw some discussion in the chat back and forth about whether it is in fact correct to say that the United States military wouldn't have done this. But like, whoever is right about that, it's also a little funny to think that that's the baseline.
Yeah. Right.
Like, I don't know. I mean, surely, like, maybe I could see saying if the US, you know, if the US military wouldn't do it, wow, it must be really bad. Right. You know, but like, you know, but I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't really seem like the United States has historically been an exemplar of like, you know, how to, you know, fight a just war justly, right? You know, like given, you know, just, you know, Vietnam, Iraq, you know, Afghanistan, etc. Right. Like those all seem like very much not examples of that.
Right. It's like, yeah, it's like he's like sort of saying something that I could imagine myself saying, but just like with the wrong tone.
Yeah.
Where he's like, well, look, like the US wouldn't do that. Whereas like,
Right.
even the US wouldn't do that, you know? Like that seems like the right way to say that.
Yeah, exactly. Good God. Got a important, I don't know if you've seen Dizzle McFizzle's super chats on this or other shows, but he likes to ask various people variations on the same question. In this case, it's third party. It says, Ben, you think Saagar has an opinion on the hose? I can't speak for Saagar, you know, what his thoughts on the hose might be.
Yeah. I'll have to do a super chat in one of Saagar's shows if he takes them.
Yeah. Exactly. All right.
Look,
Did I say that?
No, but that's
I didn't say that.
No, but that's
so then how
basically
is
what
that
happened.
the disagreement?
But that's what happened. Is
no,
that they went
300
they
people
grabbed their
killed
hostages
is unacceptable.
in the middle of that operation. Their car broke down because they were getting RPGs and machine guns fired at them, and they called in air support. That did the exact same thing that any Western-style military would do in the exact
They
same
provided
situation.
cover and bombing on the way in and the
Yes.
way out. They did it during the day when there was a busy marketplace there. And that's how so many civilians were murdered. Not to mention, they took out multiple residential buildings, not just the two that the hostages were being held in. Not to mention, very possible that they killed their own hostages in this operation. So no, we wouldn't have done it. It's not acceptable. We have also committed war crimes. I'm not like excusing us and pretending like we're angels, but I just don't see how you look at this and say this was fine, this was acceptable. Well, that seems to be what you're arguing.
I think it is substantively different than many of the other things that have been committed. And
but they say the same thing. They say, oh, well, we bombed the refugee. Well, we got a Hamas baddie, so it's fine. We accomplished our military
that's
goal.
obviously ridiculous.
And how is this different?
Because they were in the middle of a rescue operation. This literally is different whenever you have your own troops and the civilians.
Disproportionate. Insanely disproportionate. I mean, it's outrageous to say that it's acceptable to have 300 dead to rescue 4 people when you could get them all of the hostages and protect all of the hostages who are, again, at risk because of the IDF bombing operation without killing a single person. I just can't agree with this whatsoever.
But the reason that I'm pushing back, Krystal, is because of exactly like the Ken Roth rhetoric. This idea that, you know, you're never like, you can't dress in civilian garb. I mean, I just think at a certain point, we all need to stop living in a fantasy land where everybody is just going to be abiding by the laws of war.
Oh, we're not living in a fantasy land.
No,
we're living in a nightmare.
Yeah.
People in Gaza are living in hell on earth. And so it's disgusting to me that we have US politicians who claim this as a victory when, again, if the shoe was on the other foot and it was 4 Palestinian hostages who were rescued in an operation that killed hundreds of Israelis, no one would say that was okay. And it wouldn't be okay. I wouldn't say it was okay. But because Palestinians are so dehumanized and considered so inconsequential, it's just fine to wave your hand as it's fine for it to be collateral damage.
Like I said, I think you're arguing against media personalities, which I don't even necessarily disagree with. What I'm saying, and honestly though, if I was looking at it from a Hamas perspective, I was Palestinian and 4 of our guys needed to be rescued, and then people were shooting at the people who were going to go rescue them, and you did whatever it took in order to get them out, I'd be like, yeah, okay. I mean, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but if I was in their position, I'd probably do the exact same thing. Most rational nation states and or military groups would do that.
That's not true. You just said that we wouldn't do it.
No.
You just said we wouldn't do it, Saagar.
We would not plan an operation this way, but if we found ourselves in a situation
then point to the example where we did something
equivalent. It's been a long time.
Point to a single example. No.
Caleb Mueller, I think, was our last rescue
I'm not saying we're perfect, right? We commit war crimes also. I've been very critical. But you can't say any rational nation state would do it and also say we never would have done it.
No, I said we wouldn't plan a military operation this way. But in a similar circumstance, though, if our people were under fire in the middle of a hostage rescue mission, there was no other way to get out, absolutely, U.S. military would probably pull the trigger in the same way.
But you can't point to an example where it's happened.
Well, that's what I said. I don't even know the last time I had a major rescue operation. I want to say it was Caleb Mueller under ICE. It was almost, I think, 7-8 years ago since the last time. Now, we've operated in a very different environment. I can't necessarily say Same thing. I think, again, we have a much higher level of professionalism and conduct than the way that they execute military operations. But the disagreement, as I said, is both about the difference in the way that they're quote unquote killing terrorists and terrorizing the population as opposed to a single thing. And my big disagreement is with a lot of this idea that, that we're just supposed to conduct military operations in some sort of world where everybody just abides by the laws of war. It's not like they weren't getting shelled, shot at, and bombed by
I do
Hamas on
think
their
that we
way
should
out,
avoid
which is
war
what
crimes.
happened.
I think we should avoid massacre
I agree, it would be nice, but it's
hundreds
not
of
gonna
innocent
happen.
civilians. Okay. And by the way, there's a hostage deal on the table. And by the way, this puts hostages further at risk. And by the way, it fuels the hatred that will lead to more terrorism in the future. This was a political play for Bibi Netanyahu in order to keep his grip on power at the expense of 1,000 Palestinians between the dead and the injured. Okay, there was nothing justifiable about it. And I think it is a disgusting worldview that just dismisses this level of quote unquote collateral damage as being acceptable in any context. We move on.
Okay, but this is what I'm saying. You can't just call it a disgusting worldview.
It
it's
is.
Like, then there's no operation ever where the right of self-defense or military, hostage rescue can happen under this. It's just not.
No,
it's literally
that's not
impossible.
true, Saagar.
You're
that
applying
is
it in a
not
specific context.
true.
I'm talking in a bigger generality. Which, look, I have not disagreed that there shouldn't be a ceasefire deal, but I'm sorry, this is just that is frankly a pie in the sky worldview where everybody signs the Geneva Convention.
Yeah, you know what? The reality is I would like to live in that world, but I acknowledge I don't live in that world. But even acknowledging the imperfect world we live in, you also have to admit that our military wouldn't have greenlit this operation, that you can't point to another hostage rescue mission that led to hundreds of deaths. And so to pretend like this is all fine and good and just in the normal course of operations, no, this is outrageously outside of what the world has looked like and what quote unquote rational nation state actors, including our own very imperfect country, has done in the past.
No, I'm just going to reiterate, it really does come down to what it was going to look like in the context of an actual military operation whenever you're literally rescuing hostages, a vehicle breaks down. It's like, what are you supposed to do? You're going to die or you're going to get your way out. There actually is a zero-sum game whenever it comes down to that exact situation.
You are supposed to protect civilians. You are supposed to, if you are a soldier, guess what? Part of your responsibility is to risk your life to protect civilians.
I agree with that.
Okay,
yes.
Well, that's not what happened here. Okay,
well, no, but
and
also,
again, don't greenlight such a dangerous operation to start with if it's going to potentially lead to hundreds of deaths. And if you care about the hostages, do the ceasefire deal. So I just, on every level, I find it outrageous that this is considered in any way justifiable or acceptable.
I would put it just, look, I agree that the ceasefire deal should happen. And in some ways, I think we're almost talking past each other. But I guess where really my major objection comes down to is a lot of the worldview that is put forward, I would say, by a progressive left in the context of this conflict just leaves no room for a military to operate. And in a military to operate in a manner which I think is quote unquote justifiable, not necessarily saying in this particular instance. What I mean by that is hostage rescues, the ability to conduct war, this idea that you're not supposed to disguise yourself.
Saagar, how can we?
Just want to note that as Alpha Kadafbang says in the chat, everybody did sign the Geneva Conventions. Saagar says, I'll be sure, yeah, you can choose to live in this fantasy world where everybody's going to sign the Geneva Conventions. Pretty much everybody did sign the Israel just looked it up, right? Signed the deal, ratified the Geneva Convention in 1951, right? I guess he's trying to say it's not realistic to have, think that we're going to have a world where everybody's going to abide by it. But it does actually seem like maybe a relevant fact that they did, put themselves under that legal obligation.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of interesting, Saagar kind of kept making this point, like, and it seems like his sort of like, well, you live in this world where everybody signed the Geneva Conventions is like a part of that. And he keeps making this point where it's like, okay, like your prescriptions, and like your moral judgments, they like sort of assume that, everybody in the world is going to act morally and that people aren't going to do bad things. But it's like, why would the argument that like we're committing crimes and doing immoral stuff, like why would that assume that like no other countries do immoral stuff? Like it seems like the idea, sorry, my dogs are barking in the background, but it seems like the idea is just like it would have to be that somehow other countries committing crimes like morally legitimizes or necessitates us committing crimes. But like, why would that be the case? And if that's not the case, how can you appeal to this like, in order to say what you're saying morally, it would have to be the case that no other country commits crimes? Like, I just don't understand that part.
Well, especially because like if you're going to say that, presumably the idea is that you'd be so hamstrung by this like one-sided allegiance to following the Geneva Conventions and all that that like this would put you at this huge relative disadvantage. And so maybe like just on a consequentialist level that would lead to so much bad stuff that that like this justifies doing all these war crimes. But it's like, take a step back here. This is being applied on behalf of the country, the side that is that like has a just crushingly, almost unimaginably massive advantage in like what kind of force it has at its disposal, right? That you're saying, oh, well, if that country was to abide by its legal obligations under the Geneva Conventions, to not do stuff like disguise soldiers as humanitarian aid workers with like Red Cross crosses and all that stuff, that like that would just put them at such a disadvantage. It's like, yeah, but you're talking about a country that, well, one is an actual country and has an army and an air force and all that stuff, which of course Hamas has none of those things. And at that, it's not just that, in fact, that is a nation state with its own military, but it's, it's a regional military superpower that, like, it just seems particularly crazy to do the like, oh, it's just totally unrealistic to expect, following the Geneva Conventions, from a country that's in Israel's position.
Right. Especially like in, this is sort of what we were talking about earlier, but like, it just is the case that there were like identifiable, tangible options, that Israel could have taken that I've never heard like an argument couldn't work, I've never heard an argument as to why they couldn't work, that wouldn't have involved like all of this like death and so on. And so to say like, oh, well, in a world where, we don't, break, war crimes laws, we're just going to be like, so, like we're going to be fighting with our hands tied behind our back and there's no way we're going to be able to like defend ourselves. And so there's going to be all these negative consequences. Like that just like, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that point works like broadly because generally don't accept these empirical claims that like doing war crimes is the only way out of like, these like sticky situations. And actually a lot of the time, I think that it's our aggression and our crimes that actually like engenders, further cycles of violence and aggression and so on. But like, yeah, especially in this context, it seems particularly clear cut that like, why couldn't have Israel like, why couldn't have Israel just like put more troops stationed at the wall? Why couldn't they have done targeted assassinations of Hamas members? Like there were just all these ways out, Yeah,
totally. And, so a point that Saagar keeps going back to is, well, once you'd started the operation, and you were coming under fire, which is also like a little bit funny, right? Because it's like, you didn't expect that, right? I mean, like presumably this is something you bake into your planning that like, it's very unlikely that people aren't going to shoot at you at some point over the course of, of you going into, enemy held territory. But, so at that point it was, it was us or them. But seems like two relevant points here are, one, okay, assuming that you do need some kind of backup, like military backup, like if this is just the sort of default option, is what that means is bomb the shit out of everything around you, then that seems like the larger problem in itself, right? Like that seems like you've designed the laws of war that you're operating under in like manifestly criminal ways. And two, again, like the choice was made to do this in the middle of the day, right? Like, so, which means that, that if you come under, under fire and you call in air support, for a country and a situation where the rules of engagement have been defined as like air support just means randomly bomb the shit out of everything around you. Like, then it's like, yeah, you planned this in a way that you knew that there was a very good chance that you were going to be randomly massacring an immense number of civilians. Right. So like sort of defending it by saying, well, yeah, it's not great, but once things had played out to this certain point, what else are we going to do? It's like, yeah, but what, like, why, like the fact that things were going to get to this point was entirely predictable. Like maybe you would have gotten lucky and, like nobody noticed in time or something. Right. But like, this is like, none of this is like some shocking occurrence. I mean, this is like, you must have known that there was like at least a 50%, chance that this is exactly what would happen.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point. The sort of assuming there was like no way to predict the outcome of the inevitability of like them killing lots of civilians because the truck was getting bombarded, and attacked. Like, presumably this is the kind of thing they expect at this point, and that they sort of are factoring into the decision. I also thought there was sort of like, there was this point that Saagar made, and this actually kind of connects to like what we were talking about a little bit earlier, where Saagar was like, well, you're saying that, or this is actually sort of similar to the point that that Destiny made, right?
Yeah.
Where Saagar is kind of like makes this point to Krystal where he's like, well, like your view is that, like if you're against this, then your view is that like nations can just never use self-defense. And like, nobody can ever use force to defend themselves, etc. And I just disagree with that. But it's like, what's like the entailment from like what Krystal said to like nations can never use self-defense? Like, presumably there's a lot of standards you can have where it's like nations can commit, can engage in forceful self-defense if like this threshold is met or if these criteria are met. And you can spell out criteria and you can spell out various, criteria where like this particular instance won't come out as justified, but like there are lots of conceivable instances of self-defense that will come out as justified. Right. Like that actually just seems like really trivial,
Yeah, totally. Right. Like this is, yeah. I mean, you like that, the idea that it just seems like a wildly false premise that there's nowhere to set the criteria for justifiable use of military force that's high enough to rule out this, but that's not just so high that everything gets ruled out.
Right.
Like, really?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. I mean, like,
yeah.
How about like you do a hostage operation, like, how about it's okay to do hostage rescue operations in crowded areas, but like at times of day where there aren't going to be hundreds of people milling around to market right by it, right? Like, or you could do it at this time of day, but without bombing the shit out of the area. So like, so you do have some risk that you're captured, but your only defense against that is like just like literally shooting the people, like people who are trying to, come get you. So maybe that won't work, right? Like it's like they're just like, it just doesn't seem like it takes that much creativity to come up with like a bunch of standards that we could have that would rule out this, but would still leave not only all kinds of military action, but also, specifically that would leave all sorts of military action to try to rescue hostages.
Right.
And I mean, again, it just seems crazy that it's like, and this is maybe the most frustrating thing. I don't know. There's a lot of competition, but this is one of the most frustrating things to me about this conversation, that Saagar keeps like I guess he just has this disagreement with the Geneva Convention about whether perfidy should count as a war crime, and he's just dismissing it very quickly, right? Like, it reminds me of a lot of people I know I've interacted with on social media who will like object to my referring to the war crimes in Gaza as genocide, and say, oh, that's ridiculous. They're not trying to kill like every single person in Gaza. And I'll refer them to the United Nations Convention on prevention of the crime of genocide, which lays out a whole definition. And then they'll glance at it, and it's clearly the first time they've ever encountered this definition. And within like 10 seconds, they've tweeted back, well, under that definition, everything's genocide. It's like, I don't know, man. You just saw it. You want to like maybe like chew on it a little bit longer before you conclude that like everybody was just being an idiot when they signed on to this definition.
Right. Yeah.
Like, I don't know. So yeah, I might like pause on the thought that there might be good reasons to outlaw perfidy in war, but also, like, even if you accept for the sake of argument that the Geneva Convention is too strict there, which, is not really my instinct, I've got to say. I think looking back at the last, I don't know. So the Geneva Convention was formulated right after World War II, right? So the last 80 years, let's say, almost 80 years of wars around the world, we've just prohibited too many things, right? So there's like no way to fight a war is not really what jumps out at me from that history. But like, even if we were going to say the Geneva Convention is too strict and like a little bit of perfidy should be allowed, it's like, this seems like maybe the worst possible version of that when you have like, you're using humanitarian aid trucks. Like, so, you're really opening the door to like, shit. I mean, you're a Hamas commander. Next time you see a humanitarian aid truck rolling toward you,
right.
Do you want that guy to have the thought, oh crap, this could be IDF Special Forces?
Yeah, and especially in like a particular context where you just have this like widespread phenomena of like crazy amounts of aid workers dying. And like, it's been like a long-standing problem that like not enough aid is going into the region. So it's like you have like pre-existing problems with particularly aid trucks and aid workers. And then you're sort of like exacerbating that. But it's like, it seems like there's like this weird like back and forth where like maybe I just sort of like wasn't like exactly tracking the flow of the conversation. But like it seems like there was like this weird sort of back and forth where Saagar is like, well, can you really condemn Israel for this? I mean, like, I don't think it's okay to say that you can never like act like you're a civilian or that you're like, in a civilian truck or whatever when conducting a military operation. And then, Krystal Ball is like, she's like, well, yeah, but an aid truck specifically. And he's like, okay, well, maybe not an aid truck. But it's like,
okay, well, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, how is it supposed to help in this context if there's like sort of similar actions you could take in different contexts that wouldn't be bad? It's just like, it's hard to see the relevance of that.
Yeah, exactly.
At this point, I mean, listen, the official number is close to 40,000 dead. We both know it's probably far more than that.
Probably 100,000.
When we know that more bombs have been dropped on Gaza Strip than in World War II, the devastation is more extensive than Dresden, right? When we know you have the largest population of child amputees in the world, when we know that starvation has been used as a tool of war, when we know that our political class and the Israeli political class and the entire Israeli society, with very few extremely brave exceptions, so trivializes Palestinian lives that hundreds of Palestinians being murdered to rescue 4 people is considered acceptable. When we have seen what's happened over all these months, how are you going to criticize the progressive left or whatever terminology you use for saying that this is unacceptable? Listen, I was never someone who said that there was absolutely no room for any sort of military operation in the wake of October 7th.
Mm-hmm.
But as we've discussed from the beginning, the way they've gone about it from the jump has been unacceptable from their own national security interests, and certainly from the interests of respecting any sort of humanitarian and lives of Palestinians. I mean, you have people who are starving to death. You have a famine. You have humanitarian aid that is completely blocked. You have an entire hospital system that is completely decimated. And so to say it's been unreasonable to object to the way that this war has been conducted, I find that completely outrageous.
That's not what I said. What I said is it's unreasonable to expect that. It is unreasonable to apply, let's say, the same level of outrage, logic, etc., that we would on a bombing a military or a refugee camp or leveling a building in order to kill 1 or 2 people who allegedly may or may not have been there, as opposed to an operation where the fire was the vast majority of the death, according to the Washington Post and according to the Financial Times, occurred after the hostages were successfully rescued and their vehicle broke down as a result of Hamas RPGs, machine gun fire, and there basically was a zero-sum game where they were either going to die or live and be able to shoot their way out. That is a very, very different situation, and one in which collateral damage is genuinely a tragedy, but is very, very different than how we would have looked at if you had the option to do. Look,
listen, if you buy that logic, that's the same as accepting like, oh, but the refugee camp, yeah, they killed 200, I think.
I'll tell you why.
No, hold on, let me finish. Because they say we got 2 Hamas, it was a legitimate military target. There were 2 Hamas bad guys. We got those bad guys. Collateral damage, it's sad.
The
but
reason
guess
why
what?
it's substantively different
it's war. War is hell.
In this particular case, they actually did send special operating troops into the ground. Didn't kill that many people on the way in. Allegedly, at least according to the multiple write-ups and other things that I have seen, and that the vast majority of the casualties were suffered after they actually did what I have been saying they should have been done from the beginning, which is put their own soldiers at risk and grab their hostages in order to get them out. Or if you want to kill a terrorist in a refugee camp, you should do exactly this. You should drop people down on the ground and you should go and kill them, and then you should get yourself out.
So I think we also need to acknowledge that those reports are coming from what the IDF is saying to.
Sure. I mean, what else are we supposed to do? I mean, we have a limited amount of.
Listen to Palestinians who are on the ground, who are talking about what happened.
Yeah, and they're saying that the vast majority of the deaths.
So why did they have to decimate multiple apartment buildings that weren't holding hostages? What about that? What about the people who were buried under the rubble in these apartment buildings that had nothing to do with holding hostages? What about the air cover that they provided, quote unquote, air cover that they provided on the way in, which also included gunfire and bombing? So, I mean, listen, I think we should just move on because we're obviously not going to agree on this. And, I think it's wholly unacceptable to think that 4 hostages, and by the way, other hostages possibly killed and put at risk in exchange for 300 Palestinian lives and another 700 who have been, maimed and seriously injured and more reportedly under the rubble. To think that that's acceptable or justifiable, we're just not gonna agree.
We can move on.
All right, there was another thing that was put out by Israel claiming that New York Post wrote this up. This all comes directly from IDF sources, claiming that an Al Jazeera journalist was holding 3 hostages in his home. This man's name is Abdallah Al-Jamal. No one is disputing that he was in fact killed by the IDF along with his family members when his home in Gaza was stormed. The Israeli military, or the Israeli government rather, put out a statement claiming, number 1, that he was an Al Jazeera journalist, and number 2, that he was holding hostages. As per usual, no evidence of this was offered whatsoever. So let's put this next piece up on the screen. First, by the way, Israel had claimed that he was holding.
Okay, since this was in the video, I wanted to keep watching for a minute just in case they went back to it, but it doesn't seem like they're going to. Yeah, I mean, this is actually, this is, although I was interested to see the thing about the journalist, because I have seen various people in various contexts bring this up, but like I wasn't actually aware that that was disputed. Whether this guy was holding hostages in his home. I mean, I always just thought that it was like sort of irrelevant if so, right? That like, because people would sort of bring it up and be like, oh, people talk about all these civilians, journalists being killed. Oh, here's a journalist, who was holding, who was like involved in a Hamas military operation, was like letting them hold hostages in his home. It's like, okay, but then what about all the hundreds of other journalists? Like, did they all have hostages, in their homes? Right? If not, I don't really see the relevance, but, so that is interesting to see that that's in dispute, but, in any case, I'll watch the rest of that later. I think that's probably it for the debate on this.
Yeah, well, it is it's an interesting debate, I guess. Saagar seemed kind of like, a little on the fence, a little like non-committal, I guess, throughout the debate. I guess I did think it was weird, just to recall a random moment from this section. I did think it was sort of weird when, he said something and Krystal was like, well, that's what the IDF is saying. And then Saagar is like, well, what are we supposed to do? He's like, if we have no other sources, what else are we supposed to do? It's like, well, I mean, you could reserve judgment,
Right.
You could lean towards the proposition, but be a little bit skeptical towards it, like just because like this is the only source doesn't mean it's like a good source and that you should take a strong view like based on it,
Yeah. I mean, Krystal seemed to be suggesting in response that there were other sources, that there were Palestinians on the ground. It said something different, but yeah, I agree. Even if there was the one source, it's like, okay, well, if you have one source of information, but it's not super reliable, then like, I think, yeah, maybe being a bit agnostic about that, for the moment, would make a lot of sense to me. Yeah, I mean, I guess my big overall comment on this beyond what we've already said is that it seems to me that Saagar is like so far from the worst of sort of media commentators on this stuff. I saw somebody in the chat, I guess is in Germany, saying the German media sort of starts at Saagar's position and goes to the right. But like he's so far from the worst on this. He, like he is willing to sort of pepper it with a lot of like kind of reasonable concessions. But even so, I think he's still doing what, kind of everybody in the more mainstream media does, which is to say that their baseline that's like such a baseline that I think they're not really fully aware that they're doing this, is that they basically think of Israelis as like people like us. And so when they're inserting themselves into the situation, it's as Israelis. And they basically don't think of Palestinians as people like us. So, they even in the sort of like relatively benevolent Saagar version of it, where it's like, yeah, you're still, you're not like, oh, to hell with them, there aren't any real civilians in Gaza, whatever. where you're still like, yeah, maybe you should do a ceasefire. You have some space for, humanitarian considerations and all that, right? You're not, you don't love that, just huge numbers of them being killed. You're still not really imaginatively identifying with them, right? You're still basically seeing them as this other kind of, this other kind of category that's not, that's not like you, right? So that's why you're saying he seems like he was kind of on the fence, and it seems like, well, what's his position here? It's like, yeah, there are things that the Israelis have done that he can see that they go too far, but like it takes so little to get him to be like, maybe this isn't really in the same category. Yeah. Like, it's just, that you have like a somewhat, you have like a more clearly reasonable goal, and like, well, once it got to this point, it was us or them, even though like it got to this point because we planned this in this way, right? Like it's still such a low bar for being like, oh, well, maybe this is different, right? And I know at one point he even did indulge the hypothetical about the shoe being on the other foot, but I kind of don't believe him. That like, if Hamas was like somehow, they were doing, as part of like October 7th, part 2, they were storming an Israeli detention facility, to rescue some Gazans. And, there were only like 4 people left in it, but like they still went in guns blazing. And, when they started to get out, the car broke down. So they did their backup plan, which was to have like 200 Hamas guys come out with RPGs and just like light up the entire area all around it, in order to give them cover to escape. I just don't believe that Saagar would be like, well, I don't know how much I can condemn this.
Yeah, no, I agree. It seems sort of questionable. But yeah, I guess I don't know. It felt like Saagar definitely was in seemed like he's sort of in the more like reasonable camp in terms of like right-wing political commentators talking about Israel. It also just sort of seems like almost hard to like whatever his position is, it's definitely in the more, like in the less crazy region, but I feel like there's also a bit of variance, in terms of how he portrays his position, just like in that like 20 minutes, it seems to be like kind of shifting around a little bit, but
no, I agree with that. So I was just looking for the chat. I saw one quite a while ago. I meant to go back to at the end that I could no longer find, where somebody said, well, on the one hand, what Saagar is arguing about is ridiculous. On the other hand, Crystal Ball's name is Crystal Ball, which is also ridiculous. So, they're both bad. And I want to say I do actually happen to know why she's named that. Her father, Edward Ball, is a physicist, and he wrote his dissertation on crystals. So there you go.
Nice. That's interesting.
Although presumably he did know that people were going to be doing crystal ball snickering for the rest of their life when he made that decision.
Kind of wonder if that was like a cost or an added benefit in his mind,
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, what do you got coming up? What's the do you have a next paper you guys are talking about in the podcast?
I don't know what the next paper is going to be. Let me see. I know we were talking about, we have like this whole document for like possible things to go over. I think Victor wanted to do something related to the recent Supreme Court decision, but I don't know if we're going to find anything in that vein to sort of make it work. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah.
Oh, I think we're going to talk about one about whether monogamy is like morally permissible or something.
Oh, is the one I sent you?
Yeah.
No, it's awesome. This is like Yeah, when I saw that, I was like, okay, one, that you cross a point where analytic philosophy becomes a low-key mental illness, but two, that's very funny, and I have to send this to you guys right as the paper arguing that monogamy is morally wrong by analogy to it being morally wrong to tell people that to be your friend, they're not allowed to have other friends.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, looking forward to listening to that episode, and I guess we will punch out early today. Left is best.